tonight we are in the second of 3 webinars. Last time I spoke to the principals, and tonight and the next session is about numeracy leaders. So welcome everyone. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we come to this meeting and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to thank them for taking care of this country over countless generations. My name is Narissa Leung. I'm an education consultant here in Victoria. Tonight I'm wearing my super bright scarf in the hope that it will draw the sunshine out for the rest of the term, so you can thank me later for that. I'll let you know if it works. My contact details are on the slide there. I am @RissL on Twitter, and I am AusLit Teacher on all of the other pipes. And my contact email address is over on the right-hand side. I do not have an Edgemail account, so like Ingrid, if you would like to email me, you can just contact me at narissaleung@gmail.com. The structure, if you are new to this experience, I guess it is, the Basto webinar series, then welcome. So hopefully you will have received an email with a Padlet address. We use Padlet as a back channel, so it's to encourage you to talk to each other and share resources and just to engage with the content that we're talking about tonight. So we really want to build a community of numeracy leaders across the state. And we can do that by everyone sharing resources and suggestions and experience with the content that we're talking about tonight. So I do have the address for the Padlet on the screen, and I can see that lots of you have already introduced yourselves. Hello to Harvest Home, I see you're on there. So keep introducing yourselves on the Padlet. We do love to see who is joining us in the session. And I just use this quote: everything we know about student learning and classroom practice tells us that classroom conversations are crucial to mathematics learning. And that's why we obviously can't have a face-to-face conversation tonight, but we can have a conversation through the Padlet. So please do contribute to that during the night. The webinar is 1.5 hours long, just if you're new to this structure. So buckle up, here we go. I will start off by just recapping what I talked to the principals about in the last webinar, because I think it will help you to understand the context they were provided with around the role of the numeracy leaders. And my intention was really to create the conditions for you to flourish in your role. So I've just put on the slide here the learning intentions from the principals session, so you can have a bit of an understanding about the things that we focused on. First one was that I gave them a snapshot of the current priorities in numeracy across our state, the education state targets and those types of things. Then we looked at the range of professional learning opportunities being provided by Basto. And that's something that I really encourage you to jump onto the Basto website and have a look at the numeracy suite. And there are a range of opportunities. It's a feast for numeracy leaders now. So jump on there and have a look and see what the different opportunities are, and have a conversation with your principal and start putting that into the budget for next year. I know lots of people are doing budgets at the moment. Then we looked at the role of the numeracy leader. We dug out a really old resource that the department set out, and I asked the principals to read through the role of the numeracy leader according to the department document, and then to really think about, if our numeracy leader needs to be able to do, know and be all of these things, what do I need to do as a principal to support them to do that? And just really highlighted the fact that you can't do this by yourself. You can't lead all of numeracy in your school just as a single person. So hopefully that was the message that everyone took away from that session. And the last part that I looked at in the webinar was just a few quotes around how to lead effective numeracy improvement, or how to lead effective change. And a lot of that was about do less and do it well. And for those of you who know me or have listened to me speak before, I bang on about this all the time, because it's something that we do in schools. We just keep doing lots and more and more and more, when in fact we need to be doing less and doing it well. So hopefully the principals took those messages away and maybe even had a conversation with you between after that session. So that puts it into context. When it came to tonight's session, looking directed at numeracy leaders, Caroline from Basto sent out an email to ask you what you were interested in, And this is the data that we received. And so it was pretty evident that there was lots of you asking for support with the actual leading part of it. So, and I talked to the principals about that idea of content knowledge and then pedagogical knowledge. And so I think the part that you were asking for is the leadership knowledge. So I'm feeling pretty confident with the content. I'm feeling pretty confident with the pedagogy, but it's the leadership. How do I bring other people on board? I'm doing great things in my classroom, but how do I get that to happen in more classrooms? I think that was where most of you were thinking. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I will just show you a couple of the other graphs from that survey that Caroline sent out. Have you explored the numeracy portal, particularly the maths toolkit? And it was pleasing to see that only 10% of the people who responded, and there were quite a number of you who responded, said that you haven't had time or you haven't accessed that numeracy toolkit or the Birth to Level 10 numeracy guide yet. So really pleasing to see. And I am sure on the holidays, you will spend your whole holidays making sure you've visited every single page on those sites. But I think the message here was we don't really need you to step us through every single page on that. So if we're wrong, let us know and we can put that into the next webinar, but that was our wondering, our takeaway. And the final one was that most of you, which is really pleasing to see, are working in a PLC, with a PLC approach in your schools. So very pleasing to see. And it also helps us to frame up that leadership that we're going to be talking about tonight, because we know that when done well, a PLC can be a really powerful vehicle for driving change and sustained change in a school. Okay, so after looking at all of that data, we have put it into our little machine and come up with these learning intentions for tonight. So hopefully we've hit the mark. We are going to look at evidence-based strategies for leading change. And after that, or in conjunction with that, we're going to look at the FISO improvement cycle and the really working out how does that sit alongside the leading change practice that we're going to look at. And finally, we're going to look at the first phase of that FISO improvement cycle. And I have spoken about this in the numeracy webinars before, but tonight we're going to go into it in a bit more depth. So a couple of the slides, if you did come to the last session, a couple of the slides you'll see will be similar to what we looked at with the principles. However, we're going to dig a bit deeper tonight. So that's the plan. The success criteria, you'll be able to list some of the practices involved in effective change leadership. You'll be able to outline the elements of the FISO improvement cycle, although I do really hope that you can already outline those. Considering most of you are working in a PLC, you will be able to identify those phases anyway, and you'll be able to articulate a range of tools and strategies for evaluating and diagnosing numeracy practices in a school. Because I think it came through with the survey that Caroline sent out, is really you're wanting to know, how do I lead and what do I start with, or what do I actually lead and where do I start? So, and this is probably a really good time of the year to be asking those questions. If you have classes still at your school at the moment, you do have a bit of an opportunity to start doing some of that evaluating in time for next year to get stuff started or get work started for next year. So let's start on the how do I lead change question. And before we do that, I would like you to reflect on some change that you have witnessed in a school setting, a successful change first. Everyone likes to think of the unsuccessful one because that's the fun story. I'm going to force you to think of a successful change. So I'm talking about a change that has been brought about in your school that has turned into an embedded practice, something that has continued after the focus was on the change. So it might be a new initiative, a new focus. Everyone's, I think instructional models is something that lots of people have been working on. It could be anything, but think about a change that's been brought about. It doesn't have to be a huge one. It can just be a small one. And I want you to think about what made the change effective. So when I say that, it's really what leadership moves made the change effective. How did that change become embedded in the school? So I don't want to hear what the change was. I don't want to know this program is amazing or this person's amazing. Just what were the things that made the change effective and sustained. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes just to have a discussion and think about it. And I want to see your responses in the chat. And then I'm going to let you think about an unsuccessful change. That's the fun one. You're not allowed to think about that yet though. So I'll start the timer, think about what were the things that made it effective. Okay, I know 2 minutes isn't very long, but we do have a lot to talk about tonight. Really interesting to see that people mention things like time, or that the change was well planned, or that people were consulted along the way. So when I'm asking you about this idea of leading change, what was successful, I'm really asking you to step up onto the balcony. So there's this analogy of dancing. You can be on the dance floor, or you can be on the balcony. So on the dance floor is when we're engaged in the everyday things in school. We're, knee deep in work and thinking about how we do things, and this is what I'm going to implement. We're going to use this program. But then every now and then as a leader, we have to step up onto the balcony and pull ourselves up and look back down so that we can see the whole picture. So you looking back to say, well, what made that change effective? Not what was the change, but what made the change effective. That's you sitting on the balcony, looking down and reflecting on the leadership practices. Okay, everyone, this is the one you've been waiting for. All right, time to think about a change that was unsuccessful. I'm sure you don't have one, but if you do, think about not what was the unsuccessful change, but what made it unsuccessful. What were the leadership moves that contributed to the change not being embedded fully across the school? So I'm going to put the timer on for 2 minutes and look in the chat for your Wow. I actually wish we had more time for that one because I think there's some really great data in there, some really great information that other people can learn from. So I saw people responding to say they didn't get time, they weren't sure why the change, there was no consultation, there was no ongoing professional development, those types of things. So as leaders, we need to flip that now and say, what has that taught us about how not to lead change or how to lead change? It was interesting to see in the successful change, I noticed that a few people said that the leadership team valued whatever it was that was being changed. And here I challenge you to say, to articulate, what did that look like? If a leadership team values the change, what did they actually do to show that they valued it? Did they put time in staff meetings for it? Did they make it visible around the school? Did they mention it? Did they provide money for staff to attend PD? So try to break that down so you can then apply that to whatever change it is that you are leading. All right, I want you to keep those things in mind, the successful strategies and the unsuccessful strategies. And we're now going to look at the first question, how do I lead change? And we're going to look at one approach to leading change. And I will just say here, my first introduction to the fact that change, there was this thing called change management, was when I was applying for an alternate job. Yes, everyone, I worked on the alternate. And when I was applying for the job, I remember the panel asking me, what change management process do I follow? And I have no idea what my answer was, but I knew I did not know what change management processes were. And I thought to myself, I'm going home to Google this because I've never heard of it. And I think right after that, that's when my real love of change management, or change leadership as I like to call it, developed. So I did get the job, so I must have answered something within reason, but I had no idea what I was talking about back then. Too late, I've already got the job. All right, so I'm going to introduce you to Kotter's 8-step of change model. I was first introduced to this when I participated in Bastow's Leading Literacy program about 10 years ago with Steve, Willie and Kay Cobbin. And it's something that absolutely has guided every leadership decision I've made ever since then. This is my Bible for leading change. And I don't think, even though it was introduced to me 10 years ago, I don't think you can ever see this enough, because it serves as a reminder for you, a scaffold and a reflection tool to say, in the change that I'm leading now, and sometimes when we're in the thick of it, we forget about, processes and other strategies. How am I going? I'm going to use this 8-step change model to reflect on where are we and what might we need to do to improve how we're leading this change. So if you are familiar with this model, then this will be a great refresher for you. If you're not, welcome to John Kotter's 8-step change model. So his model starts with creating a climate for change. He has these steps, and I'm going to go through these in more detail in a minute. So he talks about just establishing a sense of urgency, and I noticed that some of you in the chat said that there wasn't a sense of urgency or there was no understanding about why for the change. He says we need to form a team to help us with the change, and some of you mentioned in the chat that initiatives that weren't successful were led by a single person. We have to create a vision for the change. And then we start to engage and enable the whole organisation. So we are communicating the vision. Then we are removing obstacles so that other people can come on board with the change. We are creating short-term wins, and we'll talk about the importance of success in a minute. We are building on the change, and then finally we are embedding the change. These last two things, it is a long-term project change. That is, and you'll know by reflecting on the changes that you've been involved in, change is a slow process, particularly in schools. It's like turning a barge ship around sometimes, So we have to be in this for the long haul. You as numeracy leaders aren't going to be able to change the whole school's numeracy data in 12 months. And if you are worried about that, then you need to put that to the side and understand that it takes time to engage in this change. And we're talking about sustained change. We don't want to be leading the initiative that everyone does until we take our foot off the pedal. So we're talking about a change that is going to be brought about and sustained. Now, don't worry about thinking, I'm not just talking about whole school change here. So this model is useful for whole school change, but it's also useful for small scale change. So a lot of you might find yourselves in a position where you are a PLC leader or you are a learning specialist. So this model for change is as effective in a small group as it is across a whole organization. So let's look at each of these in detail. All right, so the first one is establishing a sense of urgency. So here we're creating the need for change rather than the want for change. And we are really getting people on board with why do we even need to change? And if you're in some settings, so particularly say a secondary setting, you will have to be explaining why numeracy, why not literacy, why not science, why not music? So part of this creating a sense of urgency is helping people to understand why this change and why now? Because we're all busy, we all have our things that we have to focus on. So is this, on top of everything else, why this? So here, there's lots of different ways to bring people on board with the change, and data isn't the only thing that will bring people on board. And sometimes data is the least effective thing to bring people on board. So this, I think, is where it's really important to know your people. So, as teachers, good practice is knowing your kids. As leaders, good practice is knowing the staff around you. So what makes these people tick? What do they care about? And then for you to understand that so you can use it when helping them to see how your change initiative is relevant to the things that they care about. So here, it's not always kind of the doom and gloom. If we don't change this, then this will happen. Sometimes we need to sell it as an opportunity. So we have an opportunity to work on this or adjust this or make tweaks to this. And I would absolutely encourage you to watch Simon Sinek's TED Talk. It's 15 minutes. It's on YouTube. The audio isn't very good, but his message is absolutely spot on. So he talks about people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So in schools, we're really good at saying, oh yes, this is what we do. We do this many maths lessons a week, we do this approach, we do this, we do that, we do this, but we're not very good at articulating why. So if we I saw someone say rich tasks. So in our school, we do rich tasks. Do we know why? What's the underlying belief set around rich tasks? So that video is absolutely well worth 15 minutes of your holiday time watching it, or, APT time, whatever time. So I'm wondering, what type of things have you done to get teacher buy-in, and what's worked to get teacher buy-in to a change in the past? And I'd love to see your comments in the chat, because this is what's going to help other people when it comes to them leading initiatives in their school. So 2 things on that. One is that the chat is available after tonight's session. So if you see, and I thank you for the person who's just posted the Simon Sinek video, if you see, that was Laura from Basto, that's why they employ her here. She is so good. So if you see some resources on there and you think, oh, wow, I really want that later, make sure you keep the Padlet address, because you'll be able to go and access all of these great resources that people are sharing. Okay, so keep sharing the ways that you get people to buy in and what have you done in the past. It's not always going and visiting other schools. Sometimes it's a virtual visit. Sometimes it's doing a reading. Sometimes it's just wondering about the opportunities. Lots of different ways that you can get buy-in. The thing I will say about buy-in is do not skip this step. If you skip this step, if you don't invest the time and the energy in this step, the whole rest of your thing will fall over. And there are plenty of examples out there of where that has been the case. So you have to invest in this sense of urgency, the why. Why are we doing this? I will say too that this John Kotter's 8 steps, this is not a linear thing. So we don't, never return to this. We're constantly assessing to see how do we still have the why, or do we need to go back and work on the why? So always come back to this. If you think things are a bit wobbly, return to the why and see if that why is strong enough. Okay, number 2, form a guiding coalition. Basically, what this is about is you cannot lead change by yourself. You can be Xena, warrior princess. You can be He-Man. You cannot lead change by yourself. Sustained and ongoing change. So you need to get a team of people around you. Get the right team is the advice. And it's not a linear process, so if you don't get the right team at the start, you can go back and adjust who you've got on your team. So I've put here my tips for getting the right team around you are to think about the other skill sets on your staff. It's not always the maths passionate person that needs to be on your numeracy team. Sometimes our passion makes us hard to follow. So sometimes we need to step outside people who just have amazing content knowledge and look for people who have the leadership skills or the communication skills or who have credibility within the staff, and we pull them onto the team. The role of the principal in this is really important. There's so much research to back this up. Think about the change initiatives that you've been involved in your school, the ones that were successful and the ones that might not have been successful. What was the role of the leadership team in that? So there's a lot of research to back up the role of the principal or the principal class in this guiding coalition. They don't need to be front and center, but they do need to be deeply aware of what you're trying to do and making sure that they're championing that or valuing it in whatever way they can. So there's lots of videos that you can watch on YouTube. I do recommend for this one, the Diffusion of Innovation. Let's see how quickly Laura can get that video onto the chat for us. So Diffusion of Innovation, they talk on there about the different people involved in change. So you have the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and then the laggards. So hopefully Laura can find the Diffusion of Innovation video, and it's just a really short cartoon style video that makes you think about the people who come on to change really quickly and who might be a bit slower into coming into the change. And I don't always recommend picking people from the innovators category because sometimes you're hard to follow. And by that I mean, so I love technology, and I know that when people used to come into my classroom and watch what I was doing, they would say, oh, that's just Rish. She's just really good with all that digital stuff, and I will never be able to do that. So if I wanted to bring people on board with the change, I had to take someone else under my wing that wasn't seen as being, gifted with technology, and people found that person easier to follow, if that makes sense. So you can do a bit more research on the people in change. All right, the third one is creating a vision for change. If you don't have a vision, where are you going? And if we don't know where we're going, it creates anxiety. We're not really sure what we need to be doing. So stop and ask yourself, and maybe even the team around you or the rest of the staff, what does successful teaching and learning in numeracy look like? Or what do we want it to look like? What would our students be doing, saying, or knowing if we were successfully implementing a really effective numeracy program in our school? Look at Laura. She's put that link on there. She's amazing. So what would they be doing? What would they be saying? What would they be knowing? And what would our teachers, how would they be teaching, or how might they be teaching in a really successful numeracy environment? And then we can work backwards from there. But we have to have the end in mind. We have to know what it is that we might be aiming for. Now, just having the end in mind isn't enough. We have to have some ideas about some small steps that we can take to get there. So I'm going to share with you an anecdote from a book called Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard. And in that book, they talked about the idea of, in America, a study was done about getting people to eat healthier. So they had a vision. We want Americans to eat healthier. However, when they communicated that to the community, not many people changed their practice. They didn't start eating healthy all of a sudden. So they changed their message to break it down. So they said the overarching strategy was we want everyone to eat healthier. But they provided some strategies for how to do that. So that's part of your vision here. You need a strategy to achieve this. So they said we want everyone to eat healthier, and you can do this by changing out full-fat milk for low-fat milk. And so that was the message that they pushed. And then the research shows that far more people changed or made the change towards eating healthier by doing that than by just saying eat healthier. And it was a sustained change as well. So when we're thinking about the vision in our school, so I'm just going to use an example. So I'm going to say we want students to be able to problem solve and reason in our school. And we want them to be able to think and speak mathematically. So if that's our vision, then what might be some of the strategies that we can implement that can get us to that vision? So we will have more, one strategy might be the teacher questioning could change to enable more student talk, or the tasks that we're asking students to do will enable more student talk between students. So we've got to create a vision for what are we actually trying to achieve. Communicate the vision is the next step. This is really critical. It needs to be communicated often and in multiple ways. So if our vision is that we want our students to think and talk mathematically, how are we communicating that to our staff, maybe even our community? How are we communicating it to, or the strategy to the rest of the team so that people are really clear on what it is that we're trying to change? We can't change everything. We just want to make a small tweak to one of our practices that is driving us ultimately towards the big vision. So you need to use the guiding coalition here. So use the people on your team. Use the people that they have influence over. Use them to communicate what it is. You have to lead by example. That's pretty obvious, I would have thought. And it's probably more evident in cases where change hasn't been effective in schools, that they haven't led by example. So if I am trying to lead by example in this thinking and talking mathematically, in my professional learning sessions, I need to model the types of teaching that I want to see in classrooms. So I need to be providing time for teachers to turn and talk, or to justify their thinking, or to look at vocabulary for reasoning, that type of thing. So I need to lead by example. And the final dot point I've put up here is about over-communicate rather than under-communicate. Under-communication provides anxiety. When people get anxious, they go back to how they used to do things because that's safe and it's comfortable. So provide lots of opportunity for dialogue. Empowering others. This is about removing obstacles. So as a leadership team, say to yourself, if we want to implement this, whatever change it is, so this thinking and talking mathematically, what might be some of the obstacles that might come up? What might be some of the blockers that will hinder our staff's ability to implement this change? So it might be timetabling. Maybe it's a crowded curriculum and teachers feel like they've just got to push through the curriculum so they don't have time to, let kids have conversations about what they're doing in maths. Maybe it's teacher content knowledge around processes for reasoning. Maybe it's pedagogical knowledge. Maybe our teachers aren't really sure about the types of questions they can ask to get students engaged in deep conversation. Or maybe it's people need to go to PD or any type of thing. So what are some of the barriers that might come up? And then how can we remove those barriers? So we want to make it as easy as possible for staff to implement this change. And again, this is really about understanding the people that you're working with and understanding what might be hindering their ability to implement this change. And the last dot point here, this is the one that everyone always wants to talk about. And when we're leading change, this is the one that everyone always worries about the most. But what do I do about resistance? It is a dream to have 100% of people come on board and go, woo, let's do this change. This is terrific. Doesn't always happen. In fact, it very rarely happens. So here, my advice is, as a numeracy leader, you need to get curious rather than furious. So it is frustrating when people don't automatically come on board with the change that you're trying to lead, but your job as a numeracy leader is to work out why. What is it that's holding this person back? Is it a fear about failure? Is it a fear about being exposed for not having knowledge around whatever it is that you are implementing? So that's the hard work that you need to do to work out what it is that's holding this person back. But just like good teachers do, we've got to dig down and do some investigating to work out what can I do to bring this learner on board. And sometimes people just need change. They need time. Sorry, some people don't want change. They need time. So we need to respect that. So I would love to see your ideas in the chat for ways that you've dealt with resistance in the past, successful things that you've used. I would love an entire webinar on this, but we don't have time for that. So we're going to just share your resources in the chat for that. Tonight is just a tasting plate. So this is just the introduction to leading change. And I'm hoping that it sparks your curiosity and interest so that you can then go off and look at some of the resources in more detail. But I just want to give you the overview tonight. Number 6 is plan for and create short-term wins. So this is, we've got our idea of the end point, our vision. We've got our little steps that we're going to take along the way. And now we need to make sure that we're celebrating success. So when we see that we have moved from here, we've made some forward progress towards our vision, we've got to stop and celebrate it and say, good on us. Look where we were, and then as a reminder of looking where we're going to. So success breeds success. And in schools, we do not do this anywhere near enough. We don't celebrate our progress enough. And that's because we're relentless in our striving for improvement. But it can lead to burnout if we don't stop and say, hang on a second, let's just check, oh yes, we have moved, and good on us for moving, and what can we learn about that so that we can keep being reinvigorated and buying into the continual change. So we do need to remember to celebrate success, and that it doesn't need to be an enormous celebration. I am a fan of chocolate frogs, although that doesn't really match up with our eating healthy message, does it? I'm sure there are other ways. There are lots of ways to celebrate success. Especially if you're the numeracy leader, you need to highlight the success of other people to sort of normalize it and say, oh, look, Cheryl's adopted this and it's really great what she's doing. So people can say, all right, well, if Cheryl's made that small tweak to her work, then maybe I can do that as well. But success breeds success. Then we're looking at the really long-term stuff now. So we're looking at building on the change. So, the first change that we implemented was that teachers were going to change their questioning, or they were going to trial using more open-ended questions in the classroom. We've celebrated our success, and now we're going to move on to a new step to get us towards this vision of having everyone thinking and speaking mathematically. So we're building on the success that we've experienced and always reflecting to say, why did we have that success? What were the leadership moves? Was it the time that we provided everyone? Was it the ongoing PD? Maybe it were the resources that we purchased. So why have we had this success? And then use that to strengthen your ability to lead the change in the future. So we keep setting goals and we keep moving forward, but always celebrating the success. Finally, we're embedding the change. This is, again, it's long term. You'll see my first dot point there is documentation, documentation, documentation. This is probably the thing I see most frequently in schools, is that we get so caught up in the change that we don't take the time to document what it is that we're doing. So I want you to think about this in terms of, if a new person were to start at our school next year, what documentation will they receive that says, this is how we teach numeracy, or these are our beliefs around teaching numeracy in this school, so that you can come in to what we believe, rather than we're going to have more people. It's sort of choose your own adventure in every classroom. So we have to take the time to document, and we don't really do this enough in schools. I think we're getting better at it, especially with our documented curriculum and things like that, but we need to, what information would a new teacher have when they come into your school around your beliefs and how you teach numeracy, those types of things. So that's one way to help embed the change, especially when we're having high staff turnover maybe, or other staff coming into the school. So, and again, continue to celebrate the success. Lots of celebrating going on. So there you have it. Kotter's 8-step change model. You just need to memorize this. There's only 8 steps. There's only 8 things to memorize. But you're constantly looking back while you're in the middle of the change to say, oh, how are we going with the buy-in? Yeah, let's go back to that step. How are we going with the team? Need to change who's on the team, or we need to add people, or we've had a staff change. And just always use this to reflect on how we're going with leading the change. So I want you to reflect on your successful and your unsuccessful change, and think about Kotter's 8 steps for change, and see where in these 8 steps did you go right, and where in the 8 steps maybe did you need to have more work for the unsuccessful change. So which steps do you think were most important in helping make the successful change happen? I'm going to put the timer on for 2 minutes. I'd love to see your thinking in the chat. Okay. Thank you for your contributions to the chat. It is really great to see your experiences with this, and I think it helps you to engage with the model when you can reflect on your own experience. So I'm going to provide you with a couple of minutes now just to go through and do a reflection to say, what have I learnt as a result of this Kotter's 8 steps? What might this mean for me in my role as a numeracy leader? So, and I still love to see your contributions in the chat. I'm reading through them. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to reflect. This stop and jot activity is in the supporting resources pack that was emailed out. If you don't have access to it, then just scroll through the Padlet and there's a link in there for the supporting resources pack. Note to self, take the sound off the timer. All right, so thank you for all of your contributions to the chat. I think this is going to be really useful for you after this session. So make sure you keep the link to that. We've had a lot of questions. We always do get a lot of questions about, can you access the recording after the session? Yes, you absolutely can. Basto sends out a link to the recording. You can also go onto YouTube, that's what Dad calls it, onto YouTube and search for Basto Institute, and there's all of their videos on there, and there's some other really great videos that don't involve me, thank goodness, that are definitely worth watching. So if you ever want to access any of the videos, any of the recordings, just head over to the YouTube channel and search up Basto Institute. That was a side note. So now we're going to we've looked at how do I lead change, and we've got that idea about this is one process that we can use to help us frame up the change that we're leading on any scale. Now we're going to say, okay, that's great, but where do I start? What do I focus on? What am I actually leading? So that's where we're going to put the FISO improvement cycle next to Kotter's 8 steps for leading change. So in the chat, I'd love to know, what is your familiarity with the improvement cycle? And knowing that so many of you are involved in PLCs in your school, I'm sure these phases will not be new to you. So we're looking at evaluating and diagnosing first, prioritizing and setting goals, develop and plan and implement and monitor. Let me know your sort of fist to 5. What's your familiarity with this, the improvement cycle? 1, I'm new to it. 5, I invented it. That's so to be interesting to see what everyone has to say. While you're doing that, I am going to show you this. I just want to introduce you to this resource. I showed this to the principals in the last webinar because I just wish everyone would read this. I think it's so important for it to frame up any change that happens in a school. And it's an article from the Centre for Strategic Education, and it's written by Vic Zabar. It's an Australian article. Woo! And it says, it's called We Need to Talk About Change, No Prescription Without Diagnosis. And I'm pulling this out all the time. So you may have heard me speak about this before. In this article, Vic Zabar is talking about there's no magic bullet for school improvement. We need to first diagnose the symptoms before we go out and start handing out medication. So this is something that is rife in schools where we say, oh, our NAPLAN data is terrible. What did you guys do? Oh, well, we did this program. Great, we'll do that as well, without diagnosing your symptoms. So I always put this up first because I think we really have to understand why, and this is the sense of urgency, why we have to spend time, invest time in this evaluate and diagnose phase. Because in schools, we want action. We need to, there's so much to change. There's so much to improve. We're never finished. We're never happy with it. But we need to, why should we slow down and start looking deeply at what's going on? We need to, keep moving forward. So Vic Zabar reminds us we have to make sure that we know our symptoms, so then we know the things that are contributing or could be contributing to things like poor NAPLAN data. So the NAPLAN data isn't the problem, it's a symptom of the problem. So we have to work out what is the problem, or what might be the problem, what might be one of the problems. So I can see that a lot of you are saying kind of 2, 3, no one's invented the improvement cycle, I can see that. So let's look at the evaluate and diagnose phase in more depth. And I did look at this with the principals. I just sort of went through it pretty quickly with the principals. And I did look at this in the numeracy webinar series, the one that Laura from Bastow runs, but I'm going to go into this in more depth from a numeracy leader perspective today. And I have had quite a few emails about the student and staff surveys, so that's why I wanted to take the time to go a bit deeper into these. So if you have any questions about these, pop them in the chat and hopefully we can talk about them tonight. So in this evaluate and diagnose phase, we're really trying to work out, so we've got our idea of good, and so what we're trying to work out, this is how I explain it. I think you have your idea of good. This is what we want the numeracy practices to be causing or looking like in our school, and you need to work out where are we in relation to good. Are we really close? Are we really far away? Are we in the middle? Where are we? So then we can work out what could move us from where we are closer to our idea of good. It's a very simple explanation. Sorry about that. So here's some ideas on ways that you can collect evidence and data to help you to work out what's the current practice in our school. And I saw one of you in the chat said that the reason that one of their change initiatives didn't work is because teachers didn't feel like they were being consulted, or their expertise and knowledge wasn't acknowledged. This is where evaluate and diagnose is critical. We want to know what are our strengths so we can work on those. Who has, can't even say the sentence, you know what I mean? The strengths in our school in different areas that we might be able to call on in this change, or in our PLC that we can call on to make this change. So this is not about, pointing fingers and saying, well, it's all that teacher's fault because they're doing this, this, and this. This is about saying these are our strengths in this school. So we obviously don't need a program that's going to address those things because they're already strengths, or an approach that will address those. And what might be some of the areas for improvement. Okay, so I've added some things to this list since I showed it to the principals. The ones in orange I'm going to go into in a bit more detail, so I'll leave those for now. Student interviews, you don't need to interview every student in the school. You need to maybe just a small sample, and I spoke in the numeracy webinar about when I did this at my own school, it was very revealing about, we thought we were teaching our kids all these great skills and we thought that we were teaching maths in a certain way, and the feedback in our student interviews, when we asked them questions about, or we asked them to bring something that reminded them of maths, good maths, a lot of kids brought worksheets. So student interviews are really valuable. Maths biography, very useful for secondary students in particular, so they can just write a short summary of what's been their history of maths learning to date. That can help you to understand some of the potential anxieties that children might be bringing to the maths class. Feedback analysis is when you're looking through the work the students have been doing and looking at what is the feedback, if there is written feedback, what is that written feedback giving them? And is it helpful feedback? Is it praise or is it feedback? Also, the verbal feedback. So when we look at classroom observations, we might go in there with a lens of just looking at what's the feedback our students are receiving. Task analysis, this is all about Richard Elmore's work on task predicts performance. So often our students will do the task exactly as we've asked them to do it. And in fact, it's the task that isn't rich enough. And I recently returned from America. I went to a few literacy and numeracy conferences over there. And I had the opportunity to speak to Peggy Smith, who's a numeracy guru, while I was there, one-on-one. And I asked her, I said, in all of your experience working in schools, what's the one thing that you find is the issue with, why they're not having the growth that they want? And she said, consistently, it's the task that the students are being asked to do isn't rich enough. So she has done a lot of research on it, and then she's dedicated the rest of her life to helping teachers to build their understanding about improving the quality of the task, because she said it impacts the speaking that they can do around it. It impacts their ability to problem solve and think and engage deeply in real and rich mathematics. So that was really interesting. Summative assessment analysis is saying, of course, our NAPLAN data, all of our assessments, our maths assessments, of course we need to take that data into consideration. We don't want to just look at that though, because that does not tell us the whole story. We might have some wonderings, we might see some themes, we might see some commonalities, but you shouldn't just look at that. There's a whole range of data and evidence that we need to be looking at here. Assessment schedule analysis is, actually we're going to talk about assessment in the next numeracy webinar, which is happening soon. And this is really saying, what assessments are we doing in numeracy across our school, and what information is that giving? And is it even useful for our teachers? Do our teachers know how to get the most out of those assessments? Or are we doing these assessments because we've always done them and they're actually not providing that much information or supporting the teaching? And then we're going to look at things like the classroom environments, the school environment, even things like the budget. How much have we even provided the numeracy department? So can they flourish with the amount of budget they're getting? Timetables, and when are things scheduled? Is it always the last period of the day that maths is scheduled in high school? And how much engagement are we really going to have in that time slot? In primary school, is it actually being taught? It might be on the agenda, but are our teachers making sure that full hour or that full 45 minutes is being dedicated to mathematics, or is that accidentally sliding off? The other thing to look at, particularly in primary schools here, or even in secondary actually, interruptions. And if you do an interruption analysis in your school to see how much of our learning time is interrupted, so we've got the Year 9 assembly, or we've got the house group meeting, or we've got someone coming in to speak, or we've ended up going swimming longer. Our timetable might say that we're doing maths for this many minutes a week, but the reality with all of the interruptions, what is the reality? And sometimes that in itself is where you need to start. So it doesn't matter which program or approach you apply, if you are only having a minimal amount of minutes dedicated to maths every week, you're not going to change anything. So if you have any other suggestions for things that you have used to consider the evaluate and diagnose phase, please share them in the chat. This is a sharing community, so I'd love to see what other resources you have. The student survey, I have talked about this before. There are a couple of things I want to talk to you about, because the way that you use this really determines how much information you can extract from this. So firstly, I forget to mention that I usually use Google Forms. I always mention that, but I usually use Google Forms and get the students to type their answers directly into the form. If you're using this with junior students, say junior primary students, sometimes we have a tendency as teachers just to change the wording a little bit so it sounds more like us accidentally. So if you are transcribing these surveys for students, you have to write it exactly as they say it, because we actually want to look at the language that's being used in these surveys. And that in itself provides a really rich set of data across the school or the year level or the class. Is there any consistency in the vocab? That's what we want to know. And if there's not, what might be causing that? And do we see that as being a problem? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. So the "Are you good at maths and how do you know?" question, I think, is really important because it helps us to understand where students are getting their feedback from. So often for this question, students will say, yes, I'm good at maths, and how do you know? Because last year's report said so. And when we're asking that and it's May, when we're 5 months into the new year and you're reflecting on last year's report as your judgment of whether you're good at maths, then I've got some questions around what other feedback is that student receiving in those other, in the 5 months. So that's a really good source of information about the feedback. It also helps you to understand or to, I guess, develop wonderings around student agency in maths. So the responses to that question, are our students saying, I'm good at maths because this person told me, this person told me, this person told me? Or are they saying I'm good at maths because they themselves have been able to judge that? And that goes back to that John Hattie stuff of our students shouldn't be sitting there waiting for the teacher to dob them on the head to tell them if they're good at something. So that student agency to know, I know what good mathematicians do, or I know what success looks like in this lesson, and then being at the end of the lesson, being able to evaluate their own work against that success criteria. So we really want to see agency in those answers. So if you don't really know why you're asking the question, you can see how sometimes you can just skim over it and not really realize the rich data that sits underneath that. Of course, none of this it doesn't provide the answers, but it should provide you with, when you look at a lot of the data together, it should provide you with some themes and some things that you want to go and investigate. So I'm not saying just because every student said last year's report tells me I was a good mathematician, that means that you have a problem with feedback in your school. It's just something that, it's a flag, and I'm thinking, okay, I want to investigate that further, feedback. Maybe that's an avenue that we need to look more deeply in. So something that you're good at and something you're not good at, I want to know, again, student agency. Do these students know their strengths in mathematics, or can they give you a really long list of the things that they're not good at, and then only a tiny list of the things they are good at? And then, obviously there's some wonderings there around our student knowledge and anxiety around maths, or again, maybe our feedback. So other questions, what do good mathematicians do? That helps you to see, when we talk about what do we want our students to do, know, and be, that gives you feedback on the B. So the B is the dispositions, right? So what do we want we want our kids to be creative and problem solvers and all those words that everyone loves to use. When we ask our students what do good mathematicians do, what type of things do they think that they do? Because in my school, we were finishing things fast, and we realized that that wasn't the message that we wanted our kids to understand about mathematicians. So part of that is building teacher content knowledge around what do good mathematicians do, and then communicating that with students, not just through words, but through actions and through tasks. That's just another source of information to help you develop a wondering. What does your class do in math lessons? This, I haven't quite got the wording for this one. It's not quite right. I want to know what their lesson structure is. So if we've said that we've got this is our lesson structure for teaching mathematics, this as a leadership team provides some feedback on, is that consistent across the school, or is that dependent on whose class you're in? So if you have better wording for that, put it in the chat. Sometimes students give me a different answer than what I'm after for that one. But this is all about, trial and error. We send it out, get the responses, and then go, oh, that wasn't quite the data that I was interested in. And I always ask what they would like to change about their maths lesson. And interestingly, a lot of kids want more challenge. And that's something that we probably wouldn't assume that was the case, but lots of kids want more challenge. So, and the students are very honest usually in these surveys. So The thing with the surveys is, and some people say, oh, what about survey fatigue? You have to show the students that this survey was worth completing. So because reading through all the student survey data, as a school or as a PLC, as a year level, we looked at this and we saw this, and this is the change that we've made. Thank you, because you were honest in the survey. Kids will get sick of doing surveys if they don't think that it's actually contributing to anything. They're humans. They're exactly like us. We hate doing surveys that don't contribute to anything. So you need to be really public about, you said this, we did this, and this, this was the impact. With the student surveys, I like to do a staff survey to help me to understand what supports as a numeracy leadership team that I could be providing to the staff. This slide here, I showed this to the principals because I think it's worth considering that idea of different knowledge sets. So there's the content knowledge. That's great. I really deeply know maths. I know how everything relates and connects and, all the really rich stuff around mathematics and numeracy. Then there's the pedagogical knowledge. I know all of the hits inside out. I adopt them all. I have really good teaching practice. When those two things join together, the crossover in the middle is pedagogical content knowledge. So I teach maths and I'm really good at teaching children. Put that together and I can teach children maths. Does that make sense? So that pedagogical content knowledge. And we really want to know, do our teachers have this? Or is one of those parts of the equation missing, and do we need to strengthen that? So I showed this slide to the principals because I think sometimes we don't take this into consideration. So as far as primary teachers are concerned, there are significant numbers of Australian primary teachers who would benefit from professional learning in pedagogical content knowledge, that sweet spot in the middle. Secondary teachers aren't off the hook though, because the research says content knowledge alone is not sufficient for effective teaching of secondary school maths. So the fact that I know maths inside out isn't enough. I have to have the pedagogy, join it together, the pedagogical content knowledge, to be able to bring that maths to the students who are sitting in front of me and respond to their needs. So how can I find out what is their content knowledge? What's their pedagogical content knowledge? So essentially, what we want to know, what is the confidence? Do our teachers have confidence, and are they competent in teaching mathematics? So again, I love to do a survey, just a Google form, so quick and easy, and Google collates everything for you. So these are some of the questions that I ask, and we will send out a copy of the slides after this, so you don't have to worry about quickly scribbling all of these down. But the things that I want to know about, I really want to know about what is their journey as a maths learner been. Sometimes that can impact any anxieties, potential anxieties they might have around teaching mathematics. I want to know what they think their strengths are in teaching numeracy, and because I want to use that to hopefully leverage it and assist other people. What do they think their areas for improvement are? What's the research or the PD or the approach that they base their teaching on? And this is so interesting. In schools, it is so varied. So, we've all been to the PD where someone shows you some really fun activities, so all of my teaching is based on that. Or is it, I did a maths degree at university and all of the way that I teach is based on that. It's very interesting to see. A question that you can't leave off for the teachers is you need to ask them to list the last 3 maths PDs or numeracy PDs that they've attended. And when were they and what were they focused on? This is very telling, and the reason is, I'll show you this quote, being highly effective was not positively associated with high levels of qualification in mathematics. So just because I went all the way through university and did, masters in mathematics doesn't make me a highly effective teacher automatically. What did predict effectiveness was the amount of continued professional development in mathematics education a teacher has undertaken. So that was a research by Mike Askew and colleagues, and they worked with 90 teachers to work out what makes a teacher, what makes one numeracy teacher more effective than another. So, and what is it at the end of the day? It is that ongoing professional learning that the teachers are engaged in. So in that teacher survey, we want to know, what are the last 3 PDs that you've been to, or what professional learning opportunities have you been involved in for numeracy? maybe it was a really long time ago. Maybe it's time for us as a numeracy leadership team to provide access to opportunities for that ongoing professional learning. If you think about it, it's really true for any subject, I would argue. And I also asked a question there about how much numeracy-related homework do you assign. Just if you're interested in having consistency across the school, it'd be interesting to see what the homework was too. Obviously, there's a lot of research around around homework and different views on that. So that's this teacher survey usually, so do student survey and then the teacher survey, these two things usually align. It's so interesting. It's absolutely fascinating to see how they align, and some real themes can start to emerge. So I like to do these first before going to look at the data, as the achievement and growth data. So I've already got some wonderings going on in my mind of things I'd like to look at further. Speaking of effective teachers, I'm going to draw your attention to this, this piece of research around effective numeracy teaching. So this comes from, well, it doesn't come from, it's situated in the Birth to Level 10 Numeracy Guide, our own department's numeracy guide. If you go to the evidence base on that page, and it is a research that was linked to the early numeracy research project, and it looked at, it was early numeracy, so in the younger years of numeracy, and the research was done in 2002, so nearly old enough to vote. But I think when you have a look at this, you'll agree that the characteristics, I would argue, are still relevant today and still relevant across all year levels of teaching numeracy. So what I want you to do is, in the supporting resources pack, I've provided a copy of the 25 characteristics of effective numeracy teachers. I want you to read through those and have a look to see, are there any things that you would add? Are there any changes that you would make? If you're, say you're in a secondary setting, would any of these things not be applicable to effective teaching of numeracy in the secondary setting? How might you use your knowledge of these 25 characteristics to look at the practices in your school currently? So I'm going to give you 4 minutes to read through it. There's only 25 and they're all dot points. So read through it and then share your thinking in the chat. So this is in the supporting resources pack that was emailed out. Thank you, everyone. Just reading through all of your responses, and I see someone's shared another great resource on there, a similar resource. So thank you so much for that. I do appreciate it. I think everyone else appreciates it as well. As you have said, I absolutely would use this list as a bit of an evaluation for me, a bit of a checklist maybe when I'm thinking about trying to work out what's happening in our school. These assessments, or this what we're talking about today, this is as a numeracy leader. So we're trying to work out what is it that's happening in our setting, our PLC, our year level, our school, so that we can help to think about, we can work out what it is that we want to focus on. There are lots of other assessment practices that, of course, we're going to engage in. And I see someone put in there about thumbs up, thumbs down, all of those types of things. Absolutely. What we're talking about here is as a numeracy leader, that up on the balcony, looking back to say, what's the practice? And the real challenge, I think, for you, particularly in your role as a numeracy leader, is I know what the practice is in my room, but is this practice consistent in other rooms? And how do I know that? Because sometimes you'll be in a role where you won't get time to go and observe other teachers, or you won't get out of your own setting. So I think it's a real challenge when you're a teaching leader to try and work out what I think is, well, of course everyone's doing this. But actually when I have the ability to go out and, or do surveys or ask students or observe, so that's not the practice that our kids are being exposed to in every classroom. Because what we want is consistent practice. We want a system of excellence rather than pockets of excellence where everyone says, I want to be in Mrs. L's class because she does this, this, and this. We want that experience for every class. So that's what we're talking about here, that being up on the balcony and not making assumptions around what the practice is in other classrooms. How do we know that? What's the evidence and the data that we can gather? So, I was just going to say for that, a couple of things. I have in the actual research, when they were doing in another research project, the land research, they asked, which is leading aligned numeracy development, and you can read about that on the evidence base for the on the numeracy guide. The leaders of that project gave this out to staff and asked them to highlight one feature of their own practice, one that they would like to develop in, and one they thought the school needed to develop in. And then they sort of used that, the collation of all of that information, to work out where do we start and what do we focus on for our numeracy change. So I think that could be a really useful way for you to use this resource. All right, classroom observations. I just wanted to have a little word about this because I think there's some real power in this if we do them effectively. So again, we're doing this as a leader. This isn't necessarily about going in as a coach and giving feedback. We're doing this, with the intent of that evaluating and diagnosing current practice, not to highlight bad practice, but to really find out what is current practice. And then to use that information to then look at our data and say, okay, so do these two things align? What I saw in the growth data with what I saw or what I've been seeing in the classrooms that I've been looking at. Is there any alignment between those two things? Are there any things that I want to investigate further? So when you're doing classroom observation as a leader, or just as you do with peer observation really, it's best to think about your focus before you go into the classroom. And I would suggest that those 25 characteristics, that some of those might be your focus. So if you've looked at all of your surveys and you've looked at what's happening in the school and asked a few questions, and you've got a bit of a hunch or something that you want to investigate further using the characteristics, that's when you go, okay, so I'm really interested in, a lot of our kids were talking about in the structure they didn't get to talk to other people. So now when I'm doing classroom observations, I'm really interested in the teacher's questioning or what our students are being asked to do, the tasks. So try and think about that ahead of time. That makes for a more effective observation. Other things you might consider, time on task. So we talked about that interruption thing earlier. And talk. What is the talk? Who's doing it? What are they talking about? What's the level of the talk? And obviously I would recommend taking notes of some kind while you're in there and to plan your time carefully so that, say for example, you're interested in talk, that you want to go into the part of the lesson where the students are being asked to talk. Or if you're interested in what's the explicit instruction that's happening in the lesson, then you need to go at the start of the lesson and watch the mini lesson, or anything like that. So have your hunch and make that your focus for your observations. You don't need to stay in the classroom and watch the whole entire lesson. You could just go in and watch the short snippet of the lesson. Your purpose is to find out across the board or across your PLC or your year level or your school, what is the current practice? So the more kind of visits that you can make, the richer your data. All right, this is an example. If you are a learning specialist, you may have come across this. This is just an example of one template that you might use if you're going in with a specific focus. So in this scenario, going in with a focus of questioning, what are the questions that our teachers are asking our students? So when you're doing the observation, you simply writing down every single question the teacher asks as quickly as you can. I always type my observations, so just writing down every single question and not evaluating it, just writing it down. If possible, put the timing, but when you're in the thick of it, timing's not always that easy to write down. After the observation, that's when you can start analysing it. So in this example, we've used Bloom's level of thinking to analyse what type of questions are our students being asked. You could use any framework. It doesn't have to be this one, but you want to get some pre-data, because in Kotter's 8 steps, we saw how important it was to celebrate success. So we need to know where we were so that we can then celebrate to say we've moved and we're closer to where we want to be. And here's how we know. Because when we did when we did observations at the start of the year, 90% of the questions that were being asked were knowledge questions. And when we've done our observations now, we've moved and, or reduced that number to 30%, well, that's a bit extreme, isn't it? So we need data all the way along so that we can celebrate success breeds success, so that we can have more buy-in to the change. And the final thing I'm going to ask or recommend that you do, and this is probably a really good time to do it, is to evaluate the what are the things that a new teacher at your school, so a new teacher starting on the first day of next year, go around and collect up all the things that they are handed before they start their first day in your school. And what do those resources tell them about how you teach maths, why you teach it that way, where are the resources, all of those types of things. So this will be really interesting. Put yourself in the shoes of the new teacher, give you a bit of an idea about maybe some documentation work needs to happen in the school. What does your website say? So when the teacher is starting, and of course they're going to, they're graduates, so they're going to check out every single bit of information before they start at the school. What does your website say about how you teach numeracy in your school and what your approach is or what your resources are? Do you have a maths policy? What does that say about how you teach maths? Is it up to date with how you're actually teaching? So think about, use that as one of your sources of information, because again, we're doing this as a numeracy leader to say, why might our data be the way it is? This might be one of the reasons, because we think we've got inconsistent practice. What might be the reason for the inconsistent practice? Well, this might be a contributing factor. So we're always stepping up onto the balcony and saying, as a leader across the school or the PLC, what is the current practice? And I put this slide in there because I think sometimes people think that I'm totally against looking at the growth and achievement data. Absolutely not. Once I've collected all this other data, though, I'll be able to look at this data with a much more informed point of view and some really big questions that I should already be asking before I get to this as one of the sources of data in the school. So absolutely use that. Are there themes? Are there relationships emerging between all of these data points? This part, this evaluate and diagnose phase, this takes time. So if you're in the the luxurious position of being able to do some of this before the end of the year, then fantastic. If not, that's okay. You can start next year. But this is an investment of time that will help you to work out, where do I start and what should we work on? Because if you go straight into the action and you're digging in the wrong area, you are wasting your time, you're wasting the resources in the school, and you're wasting the time of the students. So slow down and work out what is the current practice and where do we need to start our change process. Okay, so I'm going to shorten this to just a couple of minutes because I want you to reflect on what you've learned and what the implications might be for you. And then we're going to come back and I'm just going to share some of the resources that I think that you might be able to access after this webinar, now that you've had your appetite a bit whet. Okay. Hopefully you've had a bit of time to think about some of the implications of this in your role as a numeracy leader. What can I do now? I've got a bit busy between now and the end of the year, but then I've got a few weeks where I've got a bit of free time up my sleeve. What can I be doing with that time? So firstly, I recommend digging out this booklet on the left. This was delivered to all schools a while ago now, but you can Google it. A School Leader's Guide to Improving Literacy and Numeracy Outcomes. And this just has some interesting information there about the role of the numeracy leader and some ideas for what you might do in each of the phases of the improvement cycle. So have a little read through that. And then on the right-hand side, I've got an image of Bastow's numeracy suite. So I really recommend familiarise yourselves with the offerings on the numeracy suite. And in the email that goes out after this, which will include the slides, a link to the Padlet, and a link to the recording, there will also be a link to the needs analysis tool. So there's a tool on here that you can go on to and self-evaluate, I guess, your needs as a numeracy leader. And the information from that is going to guide the provision of some of the professional learning that's being offered later in the year. So that'll be included in the link as well. If you know me well, you'll know I always recommend books because I love books, and I think that you can engage in professional learning whenever you like, in your own lounge room or wherever. So these are just 3 of the books that I recommend that are relevant to tonight's topic. The first one is called Our Iceberg is Melting. This relates to John Kotter's 8 Steps for Change. It's not my favourite book, I'm going to say that right now, but it does, because he doesn't really have a book about all of his work on leading change. He does have an article in the Harvard Business Review, but this is the closest thing he has to a book about the 8 steps. And so this is sort of told, it's a narrative nonfiction, so it tells the story of leading change using this colony of penguins. It does help with your understanding about each of the 8 steps. The next book is Small Steps, Big Changes. I didn't refer to this in tonight's webinar, but I think it would be really useful for you as numeracy leaders because it outlines a couple of schools' journey in numeracy improvement in their school and talks about the different steps that they went through and what did they actually do. So I found it really useful, and I think it is a good book, and it's pretty easy to read and provides lots of examples. And the third one, it's an Australian text. Yay! More Australian texts are needed. So Leading Improvements in Student Numeracy, and this looks at some of the different research that's happened in Australia. It actually follows the LAND project, the one I talked to you about before, the Leading Aligned Numeracy, I can't remember the last letter now. And so it talks about what they found in that project using those characteristics. So it does have some useful information in there, and just put it up there because it's Australian, so that's fantastic. I am going to leave you with this slide. It is the success criteria for tonight. I will also say we do want to know, what do you want to know more about for the next webinar? So you could either put that in the chat or you could reply to the email when it gets sent out. And I was considering, do people want to hear from other numeracy leaders maybe in a Q&A style for next time? If you would be happy to be one of the people who we ask the Qs to, then please let us know. I think other numeracy leaders would love to be able to ask people who have been in the role for a bit or have experienced success in the role of numeracy leader. We always like to ask them questions. So people who are a little bit further down the track. So if you think that sounds like something that you're interested in, pop it in the chat or send us an email. Otherwise, we would love to know, what do you want to know more about? What support do you want as a numeracy leader? We are here for you. So I am hoping that after tonight's webinar, you'll be excited and invigorated and inspired to go away and learn more about leading change, just in case you find yourself in an interview where people ask you that same question that I was asked all those years ago. So hopefully you found some use in tonight's webinar, and I look forward to seeing you again at the next webinar. Have a great few weeks, everyone. Good night.